Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
This week on Wichita Liberty TV, Jonathan Williams is Vice President of the Center for State Fiscal Reform and Director, Task Force on Tax and Fiscal Policy at American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. He works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the states. Prior to joining ALEC, Williams served as staff economist at the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, authoring numerous tax policy studies. His work has appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Investors Business Daily. He serves on the board of directors for State Budget Solutions, a nonpartisan good government group that pursues fiscal reform in the states. Now, Jonathan Williams. Well, Jonathan Williams, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Well, thanks for having me.
You are with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. What is ALEC? What is its organization? What is its goals?
So ALEC has been around for more than 40 years now, and we were founded to be a resource for America's state elected officials. We have about 2,000 members nationally from Republican, Democrat, Independent state legislators. We were founded as an organization to espouse the ideas of free markets, limited government, and federalism. Those are our three guiding principles. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization, and really serve as both a membership organization for state legislators, as I mentioned, but also a think tank developing original research as well as a case study approach to state policymaking. We believe in the 50 laboratories of democracy idea, and that we ought to be learning from the best case studies of the states and hopefully not repeating the errors of the worst of the states.
Now, you mentioned federalism, and I think that's something I remember being forced to read about in high school civics or something like that. And it seems like such an old-fashioned word, but what are the principles of federalism and why is it a good thing?
Well, that's actually a great question, because if you were to poll the average American or the man on the street and you ask him what federalism is today, Bob, I think you'd get a lot of different answers, and most of them probably wouldn't be the correct answer, at least the answer that the founders had when they created the Bill of Rights, of course, to the Constitution. That is, the 10th Amendment is, I think, the proper definition of federalism, and that power is not given to the federal government directly in the Constitution, ought to be reserved for the states and, more importantly, the people of the states. So it's the idea that power should be divested away from Washington and given to the governments that are closest to the people, states and local governments.
Now, ALEC is headquartered in Virginia, I think, near Washington, D.C. area. You're here in Kansas this week. Why did you come to Kansas? What are you talking about in some events?
Well, we're here in Kansas to work with our friends at the Kansas Policy Institute, KPI. I'm an adjunct policy fellow with them, and doing some events in Kansas City and Wichita during this trip, and talking about a lot of lessons that other states are going through right now on budget, tax, and pension issues, as well as talking about the much discussed Kansas tax reforms of the last few years.
And so if we the tax reform has been partly rolled back, at least in some aspects a little bit. So for our viewers who may not have paid attention the past several years, I think it was in 2012 that the first real change happened. What was that change?
Right, and the change was that legislators, including Speaker Merrick and Richard Carlson at the time, a chair of the House Tax Committee, got together with then Governor Brownback, who had only been in office for a couple of years, and said that Kansas is not competitive when it comes to its tax structure. And this is something that I've been writing about for a long time with KPI. You've been writing and talking about for a long time as well. Whether you look at it nationally or states just in the region, Kansas had started to fall behind pretty badly, and they decided that they wanted to cut taxes, move towards less of an income tax base. We follow this very closely in my book, Rich States, Poor States, with Art Laffer, talking about how damaging the state income tax is as a form of revenue for a state. And they wanted to create what they we coined at the time the March to Zero, which was to work overtime to not only reduce income tax rates on individuals here in Kansas as workers, but also over time get down to a place where they were able to eliminate the tax altogether.
And you said Kansas was starting to fall behind. What do we mean by that? What are the measures we can look at to determine that?
Kansas was falling behind in a whole lot of areas. I think that whether you look at keeping talented young professionals within the state after you've done a great job at educating them through K-12 and higher education, spending great deals of public time and wealth educating the kids in that area, and you're losing them to other states. I think that's something that's been going on for a very long time. Obviously, then you compare Kansas on the issue of, let's say, economic growth overall, or maybe just income growth specifically, of how wages grown in Kansas versus the other states. And I think you look at many of those broad categories of economic success, and Kansas was falling behind not just Colorado, which had been happening for a very long time, but starting to fall behind even Oklahoma and Missouri. And I think that was really part of the impetus to say, things are not working in terms of the status quo, and we need to really turn things around in a more free market direction for the state.
So in 2012, if I remember, we did manage to reduce taxes for everybody, but it has been controversial in that a certain class of business organization, the LLC, Limited Liability Corporation, was treated in a way far different than other businesses and individuals.
Right. And, there was a lot of complaints about the tax cuts, and I think most of it were myths that were propagated by, people like Paul Krugman at the New York Times and those that generally just don't want to cut taxes and reduce government. And that's a typical retort to Kansas' tax plan. Now, into the nuances a bit, where the idea of having us pass-through entities not pay state income tax on their non-wage income, that is profits that they wanted to keep and invest in the business. That was a pretty unique idea, and I think in our laboratories of democracy, states ought to be open to those type of ideas, and we'll see how that part of it works. But I will say one thing, Bob, is that states are emulating Kansas's approach on that, and other states are moving to exempt some of that small business income as well.
And the experiment, of course, maybe the governor shouldn't have said this is an experiment or something. I mean, it was a little bit of maybe inartful rhetoric at times, but is it working for us in Kansas so far?
Well, I certainly think the early indicators look good. Anytime you change broad policy, and we're talking this is going to be a medium to long-term effect, you're not going to see overnight effects. You're going to see some immediate effect, and we've seen that through small business filings, for instance, since the change we just talked about with small business income taxes especially. But when you change a tax code and you're looking at attracting new business and new individuals to come to Kansas now based on a new set of incentives, it's important that those incentives are out there and people are able to be aware of them and change expectations. And it's important to keep this in mind that it's a long-term play. It really is. Anyone that said differently, I think, was just being too optimistic about the tax cuts. It's not going to change people's incentives overnight. It's going to take some time for these results to be seen, but I think based on Economics 101, when you tax something less, you get more of it, and we're taxing income less now in Kansas, and that's a very important thing, and you're going to see more of it come into the state as a result.
Very good. Well, hold on for that thought for a moment, Jonathan. We're going to take a moment off for a commercial break. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, Jonathan Williams of ALEC. So we reduced income taxes 3 years ago in 2012. We skated along for a couple years, but then this year in the Kansas legislature, we had to raise taxes, not income taxes, although I think maybe we put off some scheduled decreases, relatively small amounts, but we did raise the sales tax and also tax on cigarettes. Why did we have to do that? Do you know?
Well, I think I would challenge the premise there is I don't think anyone had to raise taxes this year. I think that was a common myth that was going around Topeka and around a lot of the newspaper editorials this year, and that if spending were to be reduced and if spending were to be kept in check, I think that it was very doable, that the taxpayers of Kansas could have withstood this legislative session without any tax increases. I think it's very important to note that when you're talking about tax reform at the state level, is that taxes and spending are two sides of the same fiscal coin. And you really can't have significant tax reduction at the state level at the long term without keeping a check on spending. And unfortunately, if there's a cautionary tale to be told from the Kansas tax reform, is that spending was not kept in check enough to withstand the very aggressive tax cuts.
Yeah, I think, and we've talked about this on Wichita Liberty TV, there was just really not much appetite in the legislature to do much about spending. We knew we cut taxes, and we had, in 2012, we had a pretty large balance in the bank that allowed us to I said, skate by for a couple of years, but this year that balance was really gone, and so that's why, they decided to raise taxes, and they did raise sales tax primarily rather than income tax. And I've been of the opinion that Kansas is one of the very few states that taxes food. So that really puts, I think, a lot of pressure on low-income families in Kansas.
Well, right. I mean, and that's really the cost of government, right? And so that's why it's so important to keep government limited. I know you've made this argument for a long time. I will say, though, instead of raising income taxes, which I think would have had a horrible effect if they would have done that this year and really backtrack from what people are expecting now based on the rhetoric of a few years ago of the March to Zero. I think if you had to raise a tax, raising a consumption tax was probably the less damaging option. Although that being said, local Senator Ty Masterson, chair of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, had a plan to reduce spending across the board 6% and would have gotten out of the session without a dime of tax increases. So I think that was a heroic effort to try to spare taxpayers from that consumption tax increase.
Now, one of the publications that ALEC has is the State Budget Toolkit, I think, which offers some policy recommendations to states so that they can get spending under control and also have a good tax policy as well. One of them is titled Adopt Performance Assessments and Management. Now, back in 2011 and 12, there were a couple bills in Kansas that might have done that. They failed to pass. This year, we have this Efficiency Commission that's looking at Kansas government trying to figure out, can we save money somewhere? Is that what you mean by performance assessment and management?
Yes, and I generally think that our philosophy in our state budget reform toolkit, and really what it is 23 ideas to save taxpayers from tax increases when there's a budget issue. And it sounds like next year there may be another budget issue. Hopefully it's not a 113-day session once again. But things like getting to more of a performance-based approach to spending, I think, is very important, because many times what we find, Bob, across other states as well, is that many appropriators out there just take last year's budget, take that as the starting point, no questions asked, and then they go into the current year budget to say, well, are we going to raise spending by 5% or 10%? And all of a sudden, the conservative option and the free market option is 5% growth of spending all of a sudden. And why is nobody asking the fundamental questions as to why is this spending there to begin with in the first place? And that's really the performance-based budget model that we are encouraging states. We think it's the best practice. It's worked in states across the country.
And I know another thing that was there was, it says, allow the state auditor to conduct performance audits. Now, in Kansas, we do have two kind of auditing agencies. One is Kansas Legislative Research that provides services to legislators, such as trying to determine the economic impact of a proposed legislation. We also have Kansas Legislative Post Audit, which is where legislators can commission audits. But none of those two are really a state auditor, are they?
Well, not in the sense that many states have, anyways. In some states, for instance, the elections from this week, Kentucky was very much in the news with the election of a new governor there. They have a statewide elected auditor, for instance. So it depends on the state model.
So he's elected by the people. He's not an appointee of the governor or hired by the legislature. He has totally an independent source of power.
That's right, as a statewide elected official. So there's different models on how states handle their auditing function. I think really the independent model probably works the best, since they're not beholden to either the executive branch or the legislative branch and have their own authority based on their accountability to voters.
So this person then and his or her staff, they could, for example, just look at things on their own, or they might receive tips from employees or citizens that something is amiss here, and then they would have the freedom to go and look at those situations. Is that how some states have it?
Well, right. And there's a couple of different audits that we recommend, and and we certainly would think that it to be appropriate for those independent auditors to have this authority. Is one is a performance audit, but two is a recovery audit, and those are the things where they're able to go in and check for improper payments, for instance, within certain departments. And we found that when states have tried those, they've recouped millions of dollars for taxpayers, and therefore they don't have to raise taxes in a given year.
Interesting. I think another thing I think ALEC calls for is a rainy day fund, which we don't have in Kansas. We talk about we have an ending balance sometimes, but I don't think that's the same thing as a rainy day fund.
Right, and it's somewhat more optional. Some years more than others, right? So the rainy day fund is you put some sort of a statutory cap, and of course on how big it is. You don't want government hoarding large amounts of resources. That should be going back to hardworking taxpayers in many cases. But to have a rainy day fund set up for a true rainy day, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's an economic downturn that's sustained and severe, instead of going back and asking for taxes, we know there's such a thing as a business cycle, and we're going to have boom and bust years. So why doesn't the state government do the prudent thing and put something away for those down years? And that's really what our model policy goes about to create.
Sounds like something that people might do for their personal life, and maybe government should do that.
It's a novel concept, right?
Yeah, it sure is, which may be why government isn't doing that for us. Well, let's take another moment for a commercial break. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, Jonathan Williams of American Legislative Exchange Council. So, Jonathan, a couple months ago, ALEC came out with a report about state taxes and charitable giving. What were some of the findings from that report?
Well, this was an interesting piece of research, and it really was spawned by an article I read a few years ago from Boston College, that the researchers had studied what happened in New Jersey after their so-called millionaires tax that they adopted several years ago before Chris Christie was elected. And what they found was they saw a demonstrable decline in private charitable giving after this millionaires tax on high income earners in New Jersey. And so I wondered to myself and our research team at ALEC as to, does this exist across the other 49 states? And what we found in this report is it absolutely exists, that when you tax more at the state level, you're going to find less in terms of charitable giving, both in levels in terms of growth rates. And this is true over the last 15 years of data that we analyzed. This comes from the IRS that we're easily able to track based on people who file income taxes and claim the charitable deduction, what's going on state to state. And it's very, very interesting.
Is it I mean, naturally, if government takes more in taxes, people have less to spend on everything, including charitable giving. I wonder, is there also an effect, when there's a natural disaster, sometimes I'm, urged to, send money to the Red Cross, but then sometimes I think, they're going to get hundreds of millions of dollars from Congress and so forth. Let's just let the government take care of it. Is there some of that effect too, do you think?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head right there, is that there's really the two effects, and that is when people have less, they give less in terms of disposable income, and obviously taxes directly reduce people's disposable income. So that's kind of the easy part of the equation. The other part, as you allude to, is a little bit less intuitive, and that is the crowding out effect, if you will.
That's
and this
word.
Is something that Arthur Brooks, the head of American Enterprise Institute in D.C., has done really the seminal academic research on, and he's found this to be true at the federal level. But we also found that effect exists at the state level, that when people think that they have really paid their fair share to charity through government taxes, that they don't really feel obligated to give to private charity. And that's an unfortunate, really unintended consequence of big government, but it certainly holds.
And we know that there is a big difference between charity and government, and I think most people agree that private charities are more accountable and do a better job than government programs.
Well, I think that point is so important, and that those that both on the left and the right that really do care about the outcomes of disadvantaged individuals within communities should be looking very closely at the effectiveness and the accountability of private charity versus government. And I think the results are very, very clear that private charities do a much better job, have much better outcomes of lifting people actually out of dire economic situations.
Now, There's a bit of criticism of ALEC, as you probably know. Here in Kansas, maybe a little bit more important because some of our legislators, like our Senate President Susan Wagle, has had leadership positions in ALEC in the past. I'm not exactly sure what it was. But they say ALEC is a corporate bill mill, that they're just out there, they write up laws, and they just magically push them on state legislators, and boom, they become law. How would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, it's false. Second of all, I think these people have a little bit too much time on their hands to come up with these conspiracy theories. And, third of all is, I guess it's their constitutional right to be wrong about us. But I will say that we've been around. We're very happy to be very involved in Kansas. It's one of our strongest delegations. Senate President Wagle was our ALEC National Chair about a decade ago. Speaker Merrick's on our ALEC National Board of Directors. And we're very happy to be working with whoever would like to work with us in Kansas, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, Vegetarian. We'll have them all work with us if they want to know more about what's happening across the 49 states. But it's really been a well-funded attack out of basically the D.C., New York attack machines of liberal organizations and public unions that have really tried to come after and defeat ALEC. They haven't been successful. We're, in fact, growing once again. And so the reports of our demise are greatly exaggerated.
Perhaps it may be some of it that ALEC, I think, I really find is quite transparent. For example, the state budget toolkit that we talked about a moment ago, in many of those chapters, there is model legislation. In other words, laws that a state could use or adapt or modify and actually turn them into laws that the legislature would then, of course, have to pass and a governor sign. So I have a feeling that teachers' unions and other things do this same type of thing, but they aren't as transparent as ALEC is.
That's
and
right.
I know that's saying just because other people do it, that's kind of a weak form of argument, but trying to influence legislatures is something that a lot of groups do.
It's really just a best practice idea. Model policy is just putting ideas that have worked in one state together and said this is a way, for instance, that Texas has handled performance reviews in our budget reform toolkit. And you're right, many other groups put together model policy. Legislators are very busy individuals. Many times are running not only their families but their businesses as well as trying to be a legislator part-time. And they are really wanting to know what's going on across the other 49 states. And that's really, I think, a big value add, whether it's us talking about what best practices are or whether it's unions or any other group that works with legislators.
So I think in the end, the customer, the citizen, has to do a little investigation and think, what is the motivation of this group? And one of the reasons why I supported ALEC is because free markets and limited government, while other groups are working definitely in an opposite direction.
Well, thank you for your support. And, we try to be as transparent as possible. We put all of our model policies are available for anyone to go see at alec.org. All of our publications are made available for all to see. And so we just want to spread good information on free markets, limited government, and federalism, and what's going on across the 50 states.
Well, very good. So I see that we're out of time. So Jonathan Williams, thank you for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV.
Pleasure.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next week with yet another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks.